Okay, Ascension. When I was perusing the megadoc to choose the weekend that I wanted to preach, I looked at the lectionary reading for the week, and I can remember thinking to myself, pretty much verbatim, okay, this weekend fits really well in my calendar, like, let's just check the reading, and then, oh, that's Ascension. And I was like, that might be a bit tricky. Future me's probably going to have some strong thoughts and feelings in regard to current me's choice on this one. Maybe I should pick a different reading. I'll just do a whole different weekend. And then I kind of forgot about it and buffered for a few days, and then just chose this reading anyway, and I could not tell you why. But let me tell you this, current Erin or future Erin or whatever version of me this is, does have some strong thoughts in regards to past Erin's choice to preach on this reading. Like I'm sorry, what? Let's pop back to verse 51. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. Does anyone else find this wild? I know there's a lot of wild stories in the Bible, least of which we have just explored over Easter with the resurrection story. But for some reason, I find it a lot easier to buy the whole dead than not dead thing than I find it to understand or even imagine a floating Jesus. It feels a little extra, even for God. So I want to acknowledge that there's so much we can unpack or goggle at in this moment. A moment that Luke recounts in a single, almost throwaway line. It's so short. He just briefly pops in there, and he ascended. It's so short. And the moment of ascension is also only a line or two in Mark and Acts as well. I could truly spend the next 10 minutes standing here talking about how mind-bogglingly batshit it is to think that maybe there was an actual day in history where Jesus was just regular walking around like most other people, aside from that one water thing that he did, and then he was decidedly not regular walking around and was instead carried up into heaven. I won't spend 10 minutes doing that though, but we've got supper in the back hall if you guys want to spend some time ruminating. And it's probably safe to say that the mode of ascension isn't what we need to exclusively hear from this text anyway. But I don't want to just gloss over flying Jesus either. It's okay that we acknowledge that the whole thing is a bit weird. So let's just take a second and we'll all sit with whatever imagery that brings up for us. Onwards. I don't know about you, but I have some questions. Firstly, I think there's some really interesting things to be explored around the idea of a physical heaven. In Mark's retelling of the ascension, we hear that Jesus was taken up into heaven and sat at the right hand of God. So is this heaven a place? To be perfectly honest with you, I haven't done a whole lot of my own personal thinking or reading about different understandings of heaven. I have this childlike version from my Sunday school days that includes some sort of Morgan Freeman-esque God figure in a cloudy upward place. But that version hasn't stood up against my personal faith since I was about 14. But I also haven't replaced it yet with anything more substantive than a vague idea of some other place beyond this physical realm that the being of God probably comes from and also probably resides in. So regardless of how we conceive the after place that Jesus moves to, this moment in today's reading is really big. There is a key temporal moment of before, when God incarnate is in the flesh among the people. Then there is a time of after, when the God person is no longer physically among the people that he loves. Which inevitably begs the question, where is Jesus? When he leaves, where does he go? And is he still there now? This is mind-bending, wibbly-wobbly nature of God stuff, and while it is worth exploring, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we understand the nature of this mystery any more today than the people who saw it happen in real time. The idea of heaven as a physical space also made me think about how we encounter God with our senses. How we experience God tangibly in our physical interactions with our environment. In Psalm 34, we have language like, taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see. There are stories through the Old Testament about hearing God. Moses literally hears the voice of God from the burning bush. Taste and see and hear. There are stories of rich smells and fragrances throughout our holy book too. Mary of Bethany used a costly perfume to anoint Jesus' feet when he came to her home. John recounts that the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Taste and see and hear and smell. And when Thomas couldn't believe that a resurrected Jesus could possibly be standing in front of him, Jesus invited him to feel his wounds. He said, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side." Taste and see and hear and smell and touch. These senses are a huge part of how we experience our world. From the moment we are born, it is how we learn and how we grow and how we explore. It's how we collect information, and that helps us to understand and reason with the world around us. It's how we build our relationships. And yet all the sensory information in the world could not rationalize a resurrected Messiah or an ascension event. There's a part earlier in this chapter of Luke where the disciples are traveling and they encounter Jesus on the road after he's been resurrected. From verse 13 to 21, it reads, "Now on the same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went to them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?' They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?' He asked them, 'What things?' They replied, 'The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who is a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him.'" I really love the line, "the things about Jesus of Nazareth." It feels like a really simple, understated way of naming what it is that we do in this building every week. We come to know more of the things about Jesus of Nazareth. In verse 52, Luke describes that after the ascension, the disciples returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Great joy feels like a really strange response to losing their teacher for a second time, doesn't it? So why is there joy in goodbyes sometimes? Is this what bittersweet means? Have you ever said goodbye to someone you love and you're filled with sadness, like deep, real sadness, but somewhere underneath it is a deeper, quiet joy? Maybe not joy exactly, but some sort of stillness. What is that? For me, it's the same feeling as when you've been at a rally and you know that even though the change you'd gotten out of bed for hasn't happened, Plibisec will still greenlight that new coal, but some deeper change has occurred. Something untouchable has shifted. There are new relationships and deeper hope. Unstoppable, ravenous hope. Hope that will stop the next mine. Hope that wasn't born, wouldn't have been seen or heard or tasted or smelt without that rally or protest to begin with. Earlier on this week, my small group explored the ideas of hope and loss and grief. And we talked about the paradox of love and the unavoidability of grief, especially when you dare to live a life full of love. There is a book by Lee Sales, an Australian journalist, called Any Ordinary Day. I sing this book's praises to anyone who will listen, and I've got a captive audience, so you're all listening. So if you'd like to borrow my copy, please let me know. In the book, Lee talks to ordinary people about the worst day of their lives and how they endure the unthinkable. She interviews people who have unexpectedly lost loved ones, or witnessed a tragedy, or been involved in unimaginable events. And she also talks to the people whose lives intersect with those people, like spiritual leaders, first responders, coroners. An overwhelming theme emerges from these stories. Grief is what love looks like on the other side. Grief is simply an expression of love that looks and tastes and smells and sounds and feels different. Sometimes the catalyst for that difference is that the being the love is directed to the person or the community that we are loving is gone. Love redirected transforms itself into grief. But at the core, it's still love. I have no doubt that the disciples and the community of Christ's followers were grieving. I have no doubt that they would be finding it very hard to reconcile the information they collected from their available senses with an understanding of the cosmos that Jesus has mystically disappeared into. And they must have experienced a grief twofold, as they lost Jesus and then gained him and then lost him again. But Luke tells us of a return to Jerusalem with great, unstoppable joy. Nonsensical, counterintuitive joy. Is this what grief looks like on the other side? Jesus is gone again. But now there is a new understanding of gone, a new conception of what exists beyond what can be seen or heard or tasted or smelt. And we are invited to look and taste and see. Hear the good news, smell the perfume, and do not lose heart when we cannot rationalize. These are the things about Jesus of Nazareth.